this is Jessica and Noam, and today we are here for another episode of What's That Sound to explore the drum sounds of Don't Wanna Fight No More by Alabama Shakes.
They self-produced the record with Blake Mills. It was engineered by Sean Everett. Steve Johnson was the drummer. It is one of my favorite sounds of the last decade. I'm so excited. Let's do it.
For our drums today, we made a kick cannon, which includes one Ludwig Vistalite kit with no head on the front, and then a vintage Ludwig with a fiber skin head on it. And we also used a Ludwig Superlight snare drum. On our Ludwig Superlight, we have a big fat snare drum donut, and then on top of that, we have a big fat snare drum tortilla rolled up into a burrito.
Delicious.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Delicious.
Yeah. And for our drums, aside from our Ludwig kick drum, we had the trusty Gretsch toms, and we have size 13 and size 16. For our hi-hats, we had Zildjian K-Dark 14-inch hi-hats.
So this sound is really insane. It doesn't sound even close to the way that drums sound in a room, right? It's incredibly processed, and it almost feels like you've smashed all of the frequencies up against a wall, and there is as much low end as you could possibly fit into a mix, right? But there's also like kind of as much mid-range as you could possibly fit into a mix. All these things are really exaggerated, and everything is really reactive to other frequencies, other instruments, right? Everything is kind of breathing and interacting, right? So what that tells me is there is a ton of processing going on either the mix bus or the drum bus of this track. I kind of suspected just from hearing it that there wasn't a ton of interesting stuff going on the tracks themselves. And then in trying it, I was like, whoa, we don't need to do much of anything to the individual tracks. All we have to do is process this drum as a whole to get the sound. So let's check out the kick drum. So the kick drum was actually two kick drums. We could hear that there was a huge amount of length in the kick drum sound in this song. That was a choice that I'm sure that they made partially because of the arrangement, right? Because the kicks are really sparse in this track. And when you hear the kick hitting, you really want it to like leave an earthquake, right? So we wanted to add a lot of length. Now we could just do that with a kick drum that is a closed head or something like that's going to be longer. But the trouble is that those types of kicks are really hard to control, right? And lots of times they don't quite have as much attack, and it's hard to manipulate because it's so kind of unwieldy, the length of these kicks. So what we decided to do instead was we set up a kick drum, right, that was with no front head, so it's really tight, and then we set up another kick drum right after it, right in front of it. And that was a kick drum that had both closed heads, two closed heads, right? That kick drum is gonna be really long, and the first kick drum is gonna be really short. We stuck a mic in between the two, right? Because we wanted to capture just the attack of the first kick drum. So on that, we stuck a AKG D112 and an AKG D12. We stuck both just for like two different flavors, and we only ended up using the D112, right? D112 is very scooped and very kind of bright and really accentuates the attack. And then on the second kick drum, we used a FET 47, and that is gonna get like a ton of low end, a ton of body. And when you put the two together, you get the best of both worlds. You get tons of length, tons of body, but you also get this really sharp, punchy attack. So for the snare drum, the snare sound is really kind of unique in this, and just through doing some research, I read an article that they mentioned that they used a ton of the bottom snare. Bottom snares usually are very limiting in how much you can use them. What I took that to mean was they stuck a microphone underneath the snare, but it probably wasn't where a traditional under snare microphone would have been placed, right? Usually you would stick it like very close to the snare drum and you try to get the distance from the top mic to the bottom mic similar. In this, we just stuck it where it was gonna pick up a bit of the hi-hats as well. It was gonna pick up a bit of the kick drum, and it was gonna be a more well-rounded sound in itself so that we could crank that mic up and use a lot of it and get a very kind of unique, almost throaty snare drum sound out of it. For the toms, we kept it really basic, 421s, right? Classic sound. They don't even have a ton of EQ on them. Most of the sound of the uniqueness of the toms is gonna come from the bus processing on this. For the overheads, we used Bill Bradley's recreations of Neumann U47s. Those are really big, high quality, and like enormous sounding tube mics. And typically you use them on things like vocals and things you want to add a lot of weight to. We use them on the overheads because if you stick them on overheads, you can get a ton of usable information from the rest of the drums. So these overheads were not meant to be just for the cymbals. They're meant to pick up a lot of the rest of the drum kit. And if you just listen to the overheads, they sound like a pretty usable sound just in themselves. So here's the overheads. On rooms, we were using Cole's 4038s. Those are kind of classic room mics, and we use them in a XY pattern, or I guess a Blumlein pattern because they're figure 8 microphones. And then we smash them up a little bit with a Chandler TG1. All right, so now we have to talk about the processing on this stuff, right? And this is really where the sound comes to life. This, if you take off all the bus processing on this sound, it just sounds like any run-of-the-mill drums. On the EQ, we are controlling some of the high end, right? We're taking out some of the like 2K to 8K range. We're adding some like 10 to 20K, right? So we're adding some like shimmer in the very top. And then we are also adding a little bit of low end, and what we're really doing that's significant is we're adding some low end on the sides, right? This is on the edges of the mix. We're using a mid-side EQ, and we're letting that come up so that every time the kick drum hits, it kind of overwhelms you, right? It's you feel the attack that is center, and then you feel the kind of bloom of the kick drum, and that's kind of surrounding you. So here's with the EQ. All right, now we've added a ton of low end, and we obviously have our extra kick, so that's already gonna give us this kind of really hard to control amount of low end. And the way that we're gonna control it is we're using a plugin called C6 by Waves. That is a plugin that is, it is a multi-band dynamics processor. It can be a compressor, it can be an expander. We're using it as an expander. So compressors versus expanders, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. On a compressor, when you have your source material go above the threshold, it's going to turn down the volume of the instrument. When you are using it as an expander, when you get above the threshold, it's going to turn it up. We're going to use two bands. The first band is going to be below 100, and the second band is going to be 100 to like 300, right? The way that we're using this expander is we are turning down the gain on these channels to start. So it's almost as if we're sticking an EQ on the channel and saying everything below 100 hertz, I'm going to bring it down like 10 decibels. And then I'm going to add an expander onto that frequency range. So every time the kick drum hits, right, and it goes above the threshold, it's going to boost 10 decibels of expanded volume to that frequency range. So why would I do that, right? Why take away those frequencies and then add them back in with an expander? We have attack and we have release times now. So whereas before the low end was always, the floodgates were always open, you were always getting all of this low end. Now I have something where I can say, allow that low end to hit, but then I'm gonna adjust my release time so that after the low end hits, it's gonna pull back that low end until it hits the kick again, right? So it's a way that we can really, really control the length of these frequency ranges. It also means that if we want, we can say not only should you go back to 0 when every time the kick drum hits, but boost it past that, right? So every time the kick drum hits, I want an extra bit of 50 hertz, but I only want it for a split second on the very attack, right? So we can add frequencies, but in a really, really controlled way. Next, let's add some saturation, right? We're going to turn on a tape emulator and just add saturation, and let's add a little bit of compression with a vintage warmer plugin. So it's starting to get a little bit of more vibe. It needs a little bit more control. So I'm going to put on 2 multiband dynamics processors. This is a multiband compressor, and we're going to put them on a multiband limiter, right? They're both by waves, and they're just going to control all these frequencies that we're starting to build up and get a little crazy with. Okay, just to be lunatics, we're gonna add an R bass to see if there's any more low end that we can kind of squeeze out of this. It's gonna be kind of synthesizing some extra low end. And then we're gonna add a decapitator just to blow everything up and make it sound crazy. It already sounds great. Just to push it over the edge, we're gonna add 3 more compressors onto this. We're gonna add another vintage warmer, right? This is just to give it a little bit of extra energy. We are going to add an L2, which is a limiter, right? Just to control some of the peaks more and make sure that we're controlling all the low end that we're adding to this. And then at the very end, we're gonna add the Sound Toys Devil Lock, which is just a really bombastic plugin, and it's just gonna add extra energy. We are going to be using it with the mix dial pretty low, so we're using it in parallel mode, but it's just gonna give a little bit of extra something. 15 plugins later, let's listen to the whole thing together. That was the drum sound for the Alabama Shakes.
Thank you for watching, and please let us know in the comments what other drum sounds you'd like to hear us break down. We'll see you next time.